Hello and welcome to This is the Way, a podcast on Chinese philosophy. My name is Richard Kim.
I'm Justin Tewald. Richard, so you've now had some experience as a parent of 4 rather than just 3, really beyond my imagination, I have to admit.
What's it been like? Sleeplessness?
Yeah.
It's chaos. I have also an 8 and 6-year-old, and they're always wanting things. They still want to play hide and seek with me, and it's become more difficult with 3-week-old newborn. I also do have a 15-month-old toddler, so he's getting crankier by the day. He's starting to form stronger and stronger desires, but much of those desires are harmful to him. So we have to frustrate them, and then of course we do, and then he gets frustrated. But it's wonderful in its kind of chaotic mess. It's a whirlpool, but it's good. My mom, who was here in town for about 4 weeks to help out with the newborn, she came from LA, and she helped us out, and it was terrific, and she had a great time.
Good.
She enjoyed the stay.
She must be marveling at the lifestyle that you live, as it's summer, we should say. We're recording in
That's
summer.
Right. That's right. It is August now, so she was, so she and my dad owned a liquor store all their lives. They had that liquor store open every day. And when I say every day, I literally mean 365 days a year, like about 12 hours a day. I think they closed 1 hour early on New Year's Day. I think that was what I remember. And Christmas Day, they also closed 1 hour early. But other than that, they worked so...
That's what qualified as a vacation for them, huh? Is it an hour more sleep or something, or an hour more relaxation?
Yeah. So it's a good day. We're spending a lot of time. It's we're both academics, which means we get this beautiful thing called a summer break, which is also funny because you have friends who just have so-called normal jobs. They get some vacation time, right? But when summer hits, we have the time off, and sometimes we forget. So I remember I would go visit back in LA, and most of my friends they're working, they're not academics, or they're doing other jobs. I guess we kind of work. But then I would be like, oh, hey, you want to go out for lunch or, for a coffee? And they're like, it's Tuesday. I have work, man. I'm like, oh, it's not summer break. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So my mom basically was at one point we're driving to the market. It's 11 a.m. And she just looks at me and she says, do you ever work? Or basically or she says something like, are you making money now? And she's like, well, you're just here all the time. And, it's great. And, I'm like, no, I'm kind of working. I mean, I work. We have summer break, and anyway, she marveled at the life of an academic. I do have to say we are extraordinarily fortunate, as I think you would agree.
Yeah, it boggles the mind, really. I mean, I think about my younger self envisioning his future, and the idea that I would have so much unstructured time probably would have really surprised me, because I started doing summer jobs, I think, at the age of 14. And so I had this sense that when you have time off, you use it to earn money, and earning money usually meant being on the clock somewhere. I don't want to speak for all academics, but in my experience, summers are in some ways busier than the regular school year. I always have this sort of accumulation of projects that I promised people over the course of the year, which I wasn't able to finish because of the teaching and administrative work. And so then by the time it's summer, I realize I have to finally fulfill all those promises. But the time is unstructured, and I'm sure it really is bizarre. I've done that. I've made that exact mistake that you've made. I've invited friends out for lunch or coffee on a Tuesday or Wednesday, forgetting that, of course, they can't slip away from work. So I'm sure your mother, having worked so much, so relentlessly for so long, is really puzzled by the nature of your work now. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a kind of alternative lifestyle, I suppose. And I mean, we are busy, that's for sure. We do different things at different times, but you're right. It's, we have a lot of flexibility, and that's one of the best things, I think, of being an academic.
Good. Well, nice to hear, a little snippet of your life these days.
All right. So today's episode is going to focus on this concept of oneness, which I find to be fascinating and intriguing. Now, we're going to have a great interview with important, excellent scholar, Philip Ivanhoe, who has written a book on it. So we'll explore the book in depth in just a bit. But the book also focuses a lot on Neo-Confucianism, which is an important area in Chinese philosophy. Important traditions have arisen from it. So, Justin, I was hoping that you might explain what Neo-Confucianism is for our listeners who might not be familiar.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's so much to say about Neo-Confucianism, so I'll resist that temptation and just tell you about the stuff that's kind of most relevant to the topic of oneness. I mean, some people may hear this word oneness and may think that it may not even have a good grip on the sort of notion of oneness that we're about to discuss. Actually, the book that Philip Ivanhoe has written on oneness, he distinguishes between a number of different senses of oneness, but I think the one that people will find most helpful is the sense that has to do with how two different things can belong to a larger whole. Sometimes that's called mutual identity. So like the way that my hands and my feet are one. It's not that they're identical to each other. Obviously, my hands and feet are different things, but they belong to a larger whole, which is my body. Mm-hmm. And the Neo-Confucians, I'll give you a little bit more historical context on the Neo-Confucians a little bit, but they're really into the sense of oneness. There's a way in which they see the most important of the virtues, which is ren, sometimes translated as humaneness or benevolence. Mm-hmm. They see some sort of self-understanding of oneself as being one piece of a larger whole, forming one body with the world. They see that as a really important sort of key ingredient of humaneness. And so oneness is a very, very prominent theme, one that isn't so well developed in a lot of Western philosophy. So that's why we're talking both about oneness and connecting it to Neo-Confucianism in particular. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a lot of people don't really know what Neo-Confucianism is. A lot of people in the West. In the West, first of all, if you kind of professionally work on Chinese philosophy, chances are pretty good that you work on the so-called classical period in Chinese philosophy. So you work on people have different ways of reckoning the classical period, but, at the very least, the kind of heyday of the founding thinkers of the major schools of Chinese philosophy, except Buddhism, which began roughly in 6th century BCE. That's when Confucius was born and lived and taught, and then ends maybe with the end of the Warring States period and the beginning of the Qing dynasty. That's one way of understanding the classical period. Some people say the classical period ends with the fall of the Han dynasty. But in any case, it was this key period when the founding thinkers lived. So all the people that like even if you haven't studied much Chinese philosophy, Lao Tzu, the legendary Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, the Taoist philosophers, Confucius, Mencius, Xunzi, Mozi, all these great thinkers that became major sort of founding figures of schools of thought, except Buddhism, lived in the classical period. So if someone refers to Confucianism as a kind of historical phenomenon in China or East Asia, there's a good chance, it's not a perfect chance, but there's a good chance that what they really mean is the Confucianism of people like Confucius, Mencius, and Xunzi, all of whom are really classical Confucians. So that's classical Confucianism. Neo-Confucianism refers to something that happens later in history of Chinese and East Asian philosophy. And for many of us who work on the history of Chinese philosophy, there's no question that Confucianism really changes in this later period, but it's kind of hard to describe succinctly all the ways in which it changes. So here's my attempt. If it's all right with you, I'll just indulge me a little bit. Mm-hmm. I basically think that the easiest way to think about Neo-Confucianism is it's what happens to classical Confucianism, the Confucianism of Confucius and Mencius especially, when Buddhism comes to town. So Confucius and Mencius lived before anyone had heard of Buddhism in China, but then Buddhism came to China, and by the Tang Dynasty, it was already wildly popular. And when Buddhism became popular in China, a number of things happened that are important for the development of Confucian philosophy, Confucian thought. One of them is that the Buddhists brought a great deal of, I just want to call it kind of technical philosophy. They brought a kind of conceptual technical apparatus with lots of technical terms and distinctions, a way of kind of systematically thinking about knowledge and reality, metaphysics and epistemology and that kind of thing. So they kind of introduced theoretical, philosophical speculation as a more technical discipline. And so Confucian philosophers, Confucian thinkers had to sort of up their game just to sort of be able to engage in meaningful, substantive debates with Buddhists at the time. And so one way of understanding what Neo-Confucianism is just to say, well, it's what happens when Confucian philosophers who are basically trying to promote the ways of life and the forms of social organization that Confucius and Mencius preached, now feel that they need to up their technical game and introduce more metaphysics, more epistemology, more terms of art.
Yeah,
That's
is
one
this
way.
partly because Buddhists will raise objections to certain Confucian ideas? I mean, was there kind of this kind of
Yes.
dialogue and
Yes.
serious kind of back and forth interplay of philosophical questioning?
Exactly. They needed to be able to defend their views. And then there's another thing that's going on, which is just that there's a way in which the language that Buddhism brought to educated discourse, the discourse of erudite scholars and intellectuals, was itself kind of attractive to people. I mean, they found it useful to distinguish between ultimate truth and conventional truth or what have you. They found it useful to distinguish between essence and function of things. And so they themselves started adopting that technical terminology, and it became sort of like a lingua franca, like a common language, which they then used to articulate Confucian iterations or variations of their views. You see, it's sort of like, not unlike actually how you and I, having studied enough philosophy in the English-speaking world, we of course are conversant with the language of analytic philosophy, so we distinguish between instrumental and constitutive and intrinsic goods and that kind of thing. It's almost very hard to get outside of that language actually after you've been using it for a while. So even as we read historical materials, we often use that language to interpret the materials, So it kind of happens naturally, I would say. But the other thing is that, I mean, frankly, maybe some true believers in the Confucian tradition will take offense at the way I'm about to put this, but it seems to me that when Buddhism came to town, as I put it, it was just so attractive to so many people. They really felt they needed to make Confucianism attractive in similar ways. So, for example, Buddhism offered a kind of picture of salvation. People could achieve, at least in principle, maybe not in this lifetime, but eventually, a kind of nirvana. They could achieve liberation from suffering. And that was very appealing to people. Confucianism didn't yet have sort of explicit views or an explicit framework for that kind of liberation or salvation. So more sort of spiritual dimensions of the tradition of Confucian thought were sort of added on or developed out of the seeds of these ideas of salvation in the classical tradition.
Now, the form of Buddhism in China is often referred to as Chan Buddhism. And as I understand that tradition, Taoism was a heavy influence. Isn't that right? So I'm wondering how the history played out there, because obviously the Confucians also did read the Taoist texts, like the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi. And there are interesting, like, sort of Buddhist ideas that seem to overlap with certain Taoist ideas. Yeah, that story probably is very complicated, but is there anything you could say there?
Yeah, actually, so Chan Buddhism is the most popular form of Buddhism. A lot of the so-called Neo-Confucian philosophers, you might say, had this kind of youth in which they experimented a lot with Chan practices and Chan ideas. So they were themselves, the sort of Buddhism that they're most familiar with was essentially Chan Buddhism. I should just pause for a minute and say the word that we're translating as Chan, it's translated as Zen in Japanese. So when we talk about Chan Buddhism, we're essentially talking about Zen Buddhism, just different language traditions which share many source texts. The Platform Sutra, for example, or the Diamond Sutra were very influential in both Chinese Chan and Japanese Zen. Yeah, so that's one form. But actually, by the time we get to the Neo-Confucians in the Song Dynasty, the 10th and 11th centuries, Chinese Buddhism has been through many different iterations, and some of them are more scholastic than Chan Buddhism. Chan Buddhism is very much influenced by Taoism, as you say, so it's kind of anti-scholastic. It's opposed to the really, really technical, erudite, kind of deliberative, highly theorized, ideological ways of teaching Buddhism. But there were other kinds of Buddhism, like Huayan Buddhism or Tiantai Buddhism, that were much more scholastic. And so in some sense, Neo-Confucianism is responding to that too. So it's hard to say. I guess I just wanted to mention one more thing, which is that because in one of the kinds of Confucianism that emerged from this stew of Taoist, Buddhist, and Confucian debate was a kind of Buddhism that offered something more like a picture of personal freedom and liberation from suffering, personal salvation, which looked Buddhist in character, by which I mean some sort of realization that at the end of the day, you are one part of a larger whole, ended up playing a really important part in Neo-Confucianism, that it doesn't play such a clear and important part in classical Confucianism. So a slogan that you often hear in Neo-Confucian philosophy is "Yu Tiandi Wan Wu Wei Yi Ti" in Chinese, which translates as to form one body with heaven, earth, and the myriad things, or the 10,000 things. That's often used to describe a kind of spiritual ideal and an ethical ideal. It describes the sort of the state of mind of someone who's achieved full humaneness or benevolence.
And where does that line come from? I mean, I know that line. Was it Zhang Zai, or who was the first Neo-Confucian to formulate that?
Yeah, so actually, I'm not sure which. It could well be Zhang Zai or maybe even Zhou Doni. I'm not sure who first used those exact words, but you see them often used to describe the state of mind of someone who achieves humaneness in Neo-Confucianism. It wouldn't be surprising if it were Zhang Zai, because Zhang Zai is the kind of philosopher who seemed to articulate the most inspirational account of oneness. So if you bear with me for just a little bit, I'll read a bit of Zhang Zai. So Zhang Zai is it's spelled Zhang. That's his family name. And his personal name is Zai, Z-A-I. He is not quite the founding figure, but an important early figure in Neo-Confucianism. He lived in 1020 to 1077 CE or AD. And he wrote a lot, but the one very short text that he's sort of best known for is called the Western Inscription. It's really just a kind of series of inspirational remarks that he posted on the Western wall of his study. That's why it's called the Western Inscription. And it was so enormously influential. Later Neo-Confucians wrote essays about it. People often cited it or even just sort of alluded to it now and then because they thought it was such a moving piece. Here's a translation from that Brian Van Norden and I did in our readings in later Chinese philosophy, just to give you a sense of the kind of ecstatic understanding of oneness that seems to play an important part in Neo-Confucianism. So here's Zhang Zai's Western Inscription, the opening lines. Heaven is the father, earth is the mother, and I, this tiny thing, dwell enfolded in them. Hence, what fills heaven and earth is my body, and what rules heaven and earth is my nature. The people are my siblings, and all living things are my companions. So I'm going to pause my reading a little bit. You see, he's sort of establishing that he belongs to a larger whole in a number of different senses. The two senses that really emerge most prominently are, first of all, he's like one member of a much larger family. And of course, he's one part of a much larger body. Mm-hmm. My ruler is the eldest son of my parents, he says, and his ministers are my retainers. To respect those great in years is the way to treat your elders as elders. To be kind to the orphaned and the weak is the way to treat your young ones as young ones. The sage harmonizes with their virtue, and the worthy receive what is most excellent from them. All under heaven who are tired, crippled, exhausted, sick, brotherless, childless, widows or widowers, all are my siblings who are helpless and have no one else to appeal to. So he's trying to say that even the people who aren't, strictly speaking, members of my family in some narrow biological sense are in some sense still very much members of the same family as I am. Mm-hmm. So that's just a sort of taste of the kind of inspirational vision of oneness that Zhang Zai helped to plant in the Neo-Confucian tradition, which became very influential later. So Philip J. Ivanhoe's book Oneness is really partially, almost secondarily, an attempt to explicate that Neo-Confucian worldview, but primarily an attempt to update it and give us a plausible understanding of oneness and the importance of oneness for the good life more generally. That's inspired in some ways by the Neo-Confucian picture, but takes account of, what he considers to be more current scientific, psychological views of the human being and human nature.
Yeah, and talking to him, I mean, I think he does offer this very beautiful kind of attempt to, through the book and through the exploration of oneness, to try to offer a kind of a meaningful way of looking at the world, profoundly ethical perspective. I mean, in a way, he's trying to create a picture of the world that we can accept for those of us who live into modern times, who accept modern science, and still accept this kind of a metaphysical, ethical worldview that isn't just matter bumping into each other, but is infused with like beauty and goodness in some sense. That's very practical. And as he'll describe it, as kind of pragmatically useful also. Yeah. So I thought that was very interesting. And because I guess, I mean, that is a real concern for, I think, people today. I mean, given the rise of science, a certain kind of empiricism, perhaps, we might just see the world as just a bunch of cause and effects and goings on, right? Just matter or atoms bump into each other. And that's all there is. It's from a very reductionistic point of view. Some people think, oh, that's just all we are, right?
Yeah.
But there's a real sense in which, from our human perspective, there are things like morality and goodness and beauty and meaning and purpose. And so how do we kind of harmonize that which seems necessary to keep us sustained and to try to and oriented toward a flourishing life? How do we harmonize that with sort of a basic understanding of the world through science as well, which is also important? So that's something I've really got out of our conversation.
Yeah, exactly. That's a major issue we ended up discussing quite a lot in the interview. Right. So for the Neo-Confucians, as you say, there's no question that there is goodness, morality, and a sense of meaning or purpose available to us. And all of those things are available to us in large part because we are sort of one part of a much larger whole. And they provide a kind of metaphysical account to explain how it is that we're one part of a larger whole, that we form one body with heaven, earth, and the myriad things. The metaphysics, I don't know if we should get into details, but they invoke this idea of this Chinese term Li, which is translated as pattern or principle, which we all share. In some sense, all the world's Li are inside of us, and therefore our Li are inside of everyone else too. And it's a very, almost, a lot of people see it now as a kind of convoluted understanding of how we're related to each other. But the point is that for them, in virtue of that metaphysics being true, a lot of these other things about morality, goodness, meaning, and purpose follow. And a good way of putting Philip J. Ivanhoe's, the sort of project of his book, is to say he's looking for a way of saving a lot of that sense of goodness, meaning, and purpose without necessarily grounding it in that metaphysics, which he finds to be sort of implausible. And he thinks that there are many other ways to do it, even just sort of bearing in mind how we've evolved as human beings and sort of co-evolved with the world more generally and how we're dependent on one another.
Yeah, that's very nice. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I think the interview, our conversation was really excellent. And so I hope our listeners will also enjoy it.
That's right. Good. So coming up next is the interview with Philip J. Ivanhoe.
All right. Well, we are very excited. It is a pleasure and an honor to have such an esteemed guest. Philip J. Ivanhoe. Professor Ivanhoe is a world-renowned scholar. He's currently the Department Chair of East Asian Languages and Cultures at Georgetown University. He's written numerous highly influential books and articles, which both Justin and I have benefited much from over the years.
Yes.
Yeah, Justin, you want to say a bit more about PJ?
Yeah, oftentimes when you give a sort of introduction to a distinguished academic, sort of list off their titles and endowed chairs, named chair positions that they've had and such, I think we can cut to the chase and say that PJ has taught and worked all over East Asia and the United States and held distinguished positions all over the place. Currently, he's at Georgetown University. I just wanted to say, as someone who's seen this other side of PJ, I mean, both you and I are sort of mentees. He's been a mentor to both of us, Richard. He was kind enough to be my sort of external, it's funny to even put it this way, but I was getting my PhD at University of Chicago, and he agreed to serve on my dissertation committee. So I guess he was technically my external dissertation advisor, although it didn't feel like that, because I think the sort of quick way to put PJ's mentorship, and I should explain to our audience that although it's Philip J. Ivanhoe in print, to many people who know him, he's PJ. The quick way to put it is this: if you take whatever job description someone might come up with at a university, sort of the basic duties that they owe to their graduate students in terms of supervision, regular meetings, and that sort of thing, that would only capture about 10% of what he's done for us. He's just been a sort of lifelong advocate. I feel like in many ways, it's due to PJ's regular intervention that I continue to be such an active scholar, even when there were all these other demands on my time and interests. And so it's really hard to describe what a sort of generous soul he is as a teacher. And it's very much on the sort of Chinese or East Asian model where sort of like an ersatz parent or something, he's managed to sort of guide us in all things, not just the sort of strict job description sorts of duties, but in so much else as well. So
Absolutely.
Anyway.
Yes. PJ is known for his legendary comments that he gives back the day after, or usually the morning. Like, no matter what you write, it's so incredible. I just don't know how you do it, PJ, but you've been an incredible help for all of us.
Positive influence in more ways than one, that's for sure.
Maybe at this point we should ask PJ to jump in and say a bit about how he became interested in the topic of oneness, which is the topic of today's discussion, and maybe provide a sketch of the main ideas of the book. Can you do that for us, PJ?
Well, I can try. Yeah, I guess if I would say there's probably identify 3 issues that motivated me in this regard. Some of them are more diverse, and I've informed some of my other work, and the final one is specific to oneness. The first would be to address what my one-time fellow student, who I refer to as my smarter elder brother, Guangloi Shun, Professor Shun, wrote an article about, in which he described what he calls the asymmetry between East and West when you do comparative philosophy, that you're usually taking ideas from the West and kind of putting them on the Chinese or Korean or Japanese material or other cultures. And there's an asymmetry there. Aren't there any ideas in these cultures that we could? And so those of you who know my work know that I've written on things like self-cultivation, or something that may come up later, spontaneity, or say ritual in ethics and things like that. All of these are things that I think have been really highly theorized in the East and across these different cultures, China, Korea, and Japan. And so I was saying one of the things that motivated me with oneness was it's a theme, whether you're talking about Taoism, Buddhism, or Confucianism, about how in some ways, at some level, people, creatures, and things are interconnected in a way that we need to address and support. So that was one of them, is to kind of say, here's a really important theme that isn't really talked about that much in the West and is talked about with great insight in the East. The second one is kind of related to that, and that is, when I say it hasn't been talked about as much, it's not like it hasn't been talked about. There are things in the Western tradition that you don't realize are there. Through the study of East Asia, when I go back and I think about the Western philosophers I study, I go, oh, wow. Actually, in the book, I have as a little quote to start one of the chapters, this beautiful quote from Bertrand Russell about how thinking of himself as being more interconnected with the world and all of this stuff just gave his life a much deeper meaning, lowered his anxiety about the fact that he was going to not exist in the world at some point, but he would still. So it was a second reason being then a kind of bridge concept between East and West. There's a lot of them. Like another one is, like, as I mentioned, spontaneity. I had read and always loved Hobbes for many years and Kant, and I never realized that both of them use this term in a crucial way in their writing. I've never seen a person that specializes in them focus on that, the kind of comparative thing. The third thing is, I'm really very deeply interested in religion, not just personally, but as a phenomenon. And I think a lot of what people that I thought were my compatriots, so-called secular humanists, I don't really recognize them sometimes, or I just think they're missing just terribly important things. They like to dump on religions and point out the shortcomings. And you could do that with my life very easily. But I'd like to see a more kind of complete picture. And one of the things that has struck me very deeply about religion, I was very happy to find several years ago the writings of Philip Kitcher, who writes on this, I think, in an absolutely brilliant way. And of course, John Dewey, who said that he wanted to develop a kind of secular view of the good and everything. But I find as brilliant, and I think they're absolutely brilliant, to say, hey, look, religion provides certain functions that no society so far has done well without. Even the ones that claim to, like North Korea, have this kind of, in my view, kind of weird, perverted fandangle on religion. That there's a lot of things about solidarity, about some deep issues about human life and our vulnerabilities and blah, 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 that religion addresses. And what I find lacking in Dewey and Kitcher, as much as I've learned from them and been inspired by them, they still have a kind of intellectualist view about what religion is. So Dewey says we need to come up with a thing, the good, that we can all embrace. And you kind of go like, the good what? We're going to talk a bit about Philippa Foot, the good knife, the good what? It's kind of broad. And I don't think people are going together and show the kind of solidarity and inspiration that we need in this world. I mean, I don't care, something that's in the news every day now, environmental damage. You're not going to get to where we need to be through prudence alone. You have to have some kind of reverence for this world. And however you want to think about that, I'm very moved by the accounts astronauts give when they go up and they look back at the dead void of space, and there's this one living thing there. Or the late E.O. Wilson once said, if you pick up a handful of soil, there's more information in that handful of organic matter than there is in all of the minerals on the moon. This is kind of like where I get a sense of awe. And what can we do to start to move toward? I'm not saying I want to start my own religion or anything, but how do we start to articulate things that religions get at and just not ignore or bracket, but just for the moment, try to describe that in a way that we can then try to relate it to other various religions. Oneness seems to me to be something. I was brought up as a Roman Catholic. I'm still very much informed by that tradition. But of course, I've studied East Asian traditions all my life. Well, Buddhism, oneness is a big deal, and Taoism, Confucius. But in the Catholic Church, at least, or in Catholic Church, in Christianity in general, there are many strands within it that recognize this is the world God created for us, and how do we relate to the rest of the world? So I thought that oneness was something that we would uplift and inspire as an aspirational idea before they brought in whatever metaphysical beliefs and goals they have. It's a way of articulating that. And I thought a way that is in and of itself, if properly articulated, inspirational. So those are my three,
Yeah, I really like this idea that we address this asymmetry between Western and East Asian philosophy that you mentioned earlier, PJ. It's true to my experience. There are a lot of people who are sort of professional philosophers that call themselves comparativists. They say that compare some sort of non-Western tradition, usually with Western philosophy. But almost invariably, that just means that they spend a lot of time talking about how a particular traditional Chinese or South Asian Indian philosopher is or is not like, say, Aristotle or Kant or Dewey or, And so it seems like the direction of intellectual resources is always moving west to east. This seems to me like a really rich, fertile area of inquiry where you really can safely say that the Chinese thinkers have thought about it in a much sort of deeper, more systematic way than Western philosophers. I mean, as you say, even Russell talks about oneness to some extent, but it doesn't seem like it's really well integrated into their thought. I mean, I often find that sometimes people will make reference to this idea of oneness in Western philosophy, say philosophy of the emotions, but then sort of treat it dismissively, like it's not something to be taken seriously. We're particularly interested in this particular podcast series in Chinese philosophy. And when we record the intro, I'm going to talk a little bit about Neo-Confucianism. So I thought maybe that would be a good point of entry for our listeners if we kind of talked about how your position is situated vis-a-vis the Neo-Confucian one. And there are a lot of questions in this neighborhood, but I guess maybe a kind of way to begin wrapping our minds around it is just to talk about what we mean by oneness. What does it mean to say that one sees the world, that I might see the world as somehow a greater whole to which I belong or see myself as one with the world? And how does that compare with the sort of Neo-Confucian view? So the Neo-Confucian view, we often say, is very metaphysical, and you totally basically don't buy at all the heavy-handed metaphysics of the Neo-Confucian view, but you still, put it on the table as an important inspirational picture, and then sort of position yourself, your understanding of oneness relative to that one. So I thought maybe we could talk a little bit more about senses of oneness that are in play here.
Sure. Maybe to start that off is kind of to come clean, I believe, a thoroughgoing pragmatist. Now, of course, people mean a lot of stuff by that. But one of the things I think I mean, or one of the things I definitely mean is I'm not trying to continue the problems of contemporary analytic philosophy. I think there's a lot of mind-bogglingly important and beautiful things there. But I think there's also something, I think they kind of are stuck with a set of problems. And I want to, as a pragmatist, I'm really not interested. I mean, give you two examples. I'm not interested in providing a new theory of truth. I think that true is just the word we use for the best account of something we have. When I want to know what's true about the world, I go and I read what physicists say. I had a pain in my side the other day, and it was persistent. So I went to the doctor and said, "What do you think this is?" And they had various things and they ran tests, and I go, "Oh, okay, I think I might have a kidney stone or something." So I mean, I just think that's what I mean by true. I don't need to have a correspondence theory or consistency theory or whatever. Or again, referring to Phil Kitcher in his Preludes to Pragmatism, he has, I think, a really telling, for me, very telling. He said, like, if you look at Descartes and you say, why did Descartes worry about the problem of skepticism the way he did? He said it was because of his, at least largely because of his historical period. Traditional religious views about truth and stuff were no longer carrying the day for a lot of reflective people. So he wanted to say, well, how can we get at the truth, outside of a strictly theological framework? Descartes could be revived today, resuscitated, I think he calls it. I think he would find that he would be dismayed that philosophers are still writing papers on, well, there could be an evil demon, I think he would just find that to be unbelievable. And that rather what he would be doing would be saying, how does somebody in today's world, where we're getting all this information from all these different sources, having more information than any human being ever had at their disposal, how do you sort through that? I mean, it's more than a theoretical problem. I think politically in this country, the inability for people, I hate this expression, alternative facts. I mean, alternative facts can be you're focusing on these facts and I'm focusing on those facts. But when you mean alternative facts is I'm focusing on these facts and you're focusing on some wackadoodle conspiracy theory that was beamed down from the, creatures that live on the dark side of the moon, we're in a bad state. So Descartes would be worried about knowledge in this practical kind of solving way, because that's the problem today.
So just to follow up, PJ, so I guess for you, philosophers, even if they're doing this kind of heavy duty, maybe they're interested in tight technical issues in logic or metaphysics or epistemology, they should always be very aware of like the contemporary issues, the practical issues, the political issues that are running through culture at this time, and trying to also think about, what can we contribute as scholars, as thinkers, as philosophers to those questions at hand. Is that kind of the picture that you're?
I mean, I don't mean to say that everybody. My son is now a theoretical mathematician, so sometimes he's thinking about the problems that he's interested in dynamical systems and things like this, without thinking about an application. But what I think a lot of people fail to grasp is, at least all the mathematicians I know, at some point have to bring this in and apply it to the road. What I'm saying is, surely you can just be involved in theoretical speculation. Then you shouldn't be so doggone serious. I mean, the way some people act as if they're, as Plato says, as if they're hewing nature at the joints. And to me, a lot of times they're just doing a kind of anthropology, And so I just think it's being fairer about the way. And also, I mean, that if you don't have a historical sense, you don't realize that this has been going on for thousands of years in our culture. People have picked up a set of problems, and yes, it's footnotes to Plato, but not in the way Plato would recognize, So I think there should be more concern, and especially for uncertain topics, political, ethical, philosophy of science. I mean, Kitcher's a philosopher. He was brought to this because you got to stop talking in these, disconnected ways if you're actually talking about how science works, right? So if you're talking about how people should live their lives, you ought to be more grounded in a naturalistic account, however you might think of that account. Now, people like Dasan in Korea, Chong Yak-yong, or people like St. Thomas Aquinas also held very strong theological, metaphysical views, but their ethic didn't require that. At least much of it didn't require that. They thought it was still plausible on, naturalistic grounds or appeals to empirical evidence.
If I could sum up your sort of response, it's, as I understand it, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, it's not that you reject the Neo-Confucian metaphysical basis for oneness because you're a fuddy-dud, or because you're somehow, you bring a sort of dogmatic materialistic disposition or something like that. It's because you're a pragmatist and you think that someone who has this sort of pragmatic orientation brings to bear the most relevant kind of natural sciences, recent empirical understandings of the world.
That's right. Let me also highlight, I could be wrong about their metaphysics. But as of today, you can't hold Li Qi theory, say you embrace the best science of our day. You can't believe in karma and reincarnation and see it's supported by the best science of our day. Now, you can still think that thinking those ways not only will lead you to see the world better in ways that are consistent with the best science, but you might also still, and I surely am, inspired by just the idea that heaven, earth, and the myriad things are one body. If all we ever did, in fact, I'll go one step further. I really like this Roycean idea that most of the ideals that guide my life are things I know are lost causes. I know we're never going to have world peace. I know we're never going to be world justice and everything, but I still want to strive for those things. So if it has to be real in that sense of realizable, I don't live like that. I don't think you need to. You can still be inspired by ideals that you think are never going to be fully realizable. Now, that doesn't mean they're hallucinations, but I know we're going to get to that later, but
Yeah, so just to kind of walk the listeners through your view a little bit, if that's all right. For the Neo-Confucians, people like Zhu Xi, Wang Yangming, and others, oneness is something we can sort of discover about our relationship to the world, right? So they have their own interpretation of this famous scenario from the Mencius or Mengzi, where you see a child about to fall into a well and you have this sudden spontaneous sense of alarm and compassion for the child. And then people like Wang Yangming expand on that and say we have this sort of similar kind of compassion actually for all kinds of things. He thinks actually you can even feel sort of a kind of remorse or regret when you see broken tiles and stones. It's these sort of human artifacts that were once beautiful are now broken, and you feel bad about that too. And all this is meant to establish that you do feel a kind of solidarity or oneness with the larger world, apparently even with inanimate, insentient things, non-sentient things. There are other things that they can say. There are other sort of experiences the Neo-Confucians can point to as evidence of oneness, such as how we sort of spontaneously kind of just harmonize with or move in accord with the larger world, oftentimes without applying a great deal of deliberate effort or energy to it. And so then they have this metaphysics underlying the experience that they think helps to explain the experience, that our original nature, our inherent nature is Li, pattern or principle, which has this Indra's net-like relationship with the Li of all the other beings in the world, so that they're sort of linked in some deep way that's hard to put our finger on. Anyway, so you think about that sort of metaphysics, that it's really interesting. It's absolutely necessary to understand it in order to know how the Neo-Confucian philosophers sort of justify their view and how they understand the world and everything. But it's basically, it doesn't really have legs. It's not really plausible. But nevertheless, you have this really interesting view. I really like the way you put it. There's, at the other extreme, I mean, one way you could respond to this Neo-Confucian metaphysics is you could say, well, maybe oneness then, if we're still kind of pro-oneness, we could say, well, maybe we should just think of oneness as a kind of useful hallucination, as something that's worth hallucinating about, And of course, there are these really interesting reports that both you and Owen Flanagan talk about. People who are nearing their end of life oftentimes find that they're able to face death with more kind of courage and comfort after having taken certain hallucinogenic drugs that gives them an experience of oneness. Anyway, so there's that view, but you position your understanding of oneness, the basis for the experience of oneness, somewhere in between. It's not just kind of mere illusion. Certainly the metaphysical basis is not true or useful in any way, but you think that the experience of oneness, as we often do experience it, does have a kind of grounding in the world, but it's neither the metaphysical one nor is it just mere kind of hallucination. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. And the hallucination view was proposed by Owen Flanagan, and I've learned a lot from it. It was expressed in a slightly different way by people like William James. I mean, he has this example. If you believe everybody likes you, and then you go around in the world, more people will like you.
Yeah, right.
Now, that most people don't even know you, so they can't like you. It's based on a proposition that's strictly false, right? So is it a hallucination?
Interesting.
And then Freud, who I've been very inspired by in this way, makes a big difference between illusion and delusions. If I'm giving my lecture and I think all the students are armed, and if they disagree with me, they're going to shoot me at the first thing, that's probably not going to, that's not true, but it's probably not going to enhance my performance or their experience. So he calls such things delusions, things that are false and are bad for you and other people. But he thinks there are things called illusions, different kinds of illusions. And many of them are good. Every time you go to the movies, you're experiencing an illusion. Every time you look at art, you're giving yourself over to illusion. But is your life better if you enjoy novels and movies and art? And are the lives of other people better? It seems to me clearly yes. And so similarly, I maybe employ an illusion when I teach. I believe that the students are going to probably find it interesting because I find it interesting, because it's interesting stuff.
That's true.
When I was at Stanford once and give this big lecture, and a young professor, and I saw a guy in the background doing this. It was kind of dark. I thought he was agreeing, and then he fell out of his chair. But these are things that enhance our lives, and they're not strictly true. Was the world created by a being? Anybody who has a definitive view about this is just talking through their hat, in my view. But is it more kind of reassuring if you think maybe? James also has the right to believe, not the will to believe. But does it harm anything, or does it enhance anything? So I'm interested in that whole set of things that aren't strictly true, but that are life enhancing, not just personally life enhancing, that are better for us all. I mean, go back to Russell, who said, "Oh, this gives me peace of mind." If it were true that normal, well-informed human beings thought it didn't matter whether anybody remembered you or were inspired by you after you're dead, then you could say, well, Russell's like those people taking a hallucinogen. He's just self-serving delusion. But I just don't believe that. I think at one point in this book or somewhere else, I said, what I'm trying to do is kind of like what Dickens did in A Christmas Carol. I'm not trying to prove that a life where you're more generous and caring is I don't know, objectively better or something. I don't know what these even mean to say that. But in the course of A Christmas Carol, you don't prove anything. You don't demonstrate anything. Demonstrate a fact. But if people follow the book, I'm sure there are some people that at the end of it go like, Scrooge sold out his real values, he wimped out. But the vast majority of us are moved to tears by this, especially as you get older and you realize you only have so many years on this. So I'm just trying to talk about things like that. And to me, oneness, and that includes the hallucinogen or the hallucination, but also the Neo-Confucian view and the Buddhist views, which I think strictly, for me, I don't believe them, but many people sincerely do.
Yeah.
I'm saying you don't need to believe them literally in order for them to function in these extremely uplifting and inspirational ways and give you an aspiration in life.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm aiming at.
So what about like that kind of ethical judgment that Scrooge became a better man? So take that statement. Is that literally true?
It's true in the sense that I said my theory of truth is not really a theory of truth. It's the conclusion well-informed, reflective people are going to come to, most of them. So that's what we mean by it's true that that's a better life.
Yeah.
All this literature. I'm not identifying some queer moral feature or saying there's only one way for human beings to develop or blah, blah, blah. I'm just saying, why do we feel that way? Well, it has to do with a lot of things. It has to do with natural selection. It has to do with what kinds of creatures we are. Miraculously, you and your beautiful wife now have another child. I'm going to be a grandparent for a second time. If you don't love babies, and if you don't find caring for them something beautiful, one, you might be just incredibly ill-informed about what human beings are. But the more you learn about us, you realize we're extremely, as McIntyre said, we're rational, dependent creatures. We're dependent on people for a long time.
Yeah.
Mention example is based on, to me, not just features of us as creatures, and also features of us as creatures in the communities in which we live in. Sometimes what makes a virtue is going to be ecology dependent. Right now, Owen and Martha Nussbaum and other people are writing about anger and defending versions of the Stoic or Buddhist view that it's actually a poison. There's a footnote in one of Owen's books to me about this, where he said,
I know that footnote, actually.
What good has anger ever done for you, PJ? And I won't count it here because you'll think even less of me. But I think there are contexts in which becoming angry is the appropriate and required response for not just for yourself, but for people, other decent people and creatures. But I absolutely agree with the view that in our modern society, especially in our culture where guns are so sickly available to human beings, anger is something we need to, really work at. If not eliminating, just learning how to control it and tune it down.
Oh, right.
Because I told my son, I said, when I was young, guys disagreed with each other and people go, oh yeah. And you'd push each other. Maybe one punch was thrown and everybody go, hey, come on. And then later you'd become buddies, and everything. Now, and you go home and you go get a gun and you go and shoot. I mean, it's not funny. It's 20 people. It's a sickness. And it's that way because of our ecology. Our nature hasn't changed, but our ecology and our cultural norms, what's permissible, have changed. And I think in really unfortunate ways. Again, I'm not going to prove that, but I'm going to say, let's really look at what the consequences of this kind of behavior is. Scrooge 1, here's Scrooge 2. Here's a young person getting angry. Here's in one East and South Asian societies, for the most part, people get angry, but it's a cultural norm to not express anger directly. This gets caricatured for a lot of East Asian people as they're cool. Well, if that's being cool, I think that's cool to be that cool.
That kind of points to one of the big payoffs, moral, ethical, practical payoffs of the book, which is that it gives us a different way of looking at virtue. So we have from you a different account of the virtues, one in which the experience of oneness and worries about being too self-centered figure more prominently. Self-centeredness, which is kind of the failure to see how you you belong to a larger whole, becomes a major source of moral failure, a way of explaining why it is that we fail to, sort of live up to various moral standards. What I would sort of describe as both the different conception of individual virtues like justice and courage, you sort of reinterpret them, but also a different account of the nature of virtue as such. And so there's a symposium on your book published in PPR, Philosophy Phenomenological Review, and you wrote a précis of the book there, sort of summing up how we understand the kind of theoretical payoff of this new account of virtues. And I'm just going to read a quote from that précis. I think it's really helpful because it'll give us a chance to kind of tell the listeners a little bit more about the book. So you say, a life guided by such virtues enables one to locate oneself within larger and more meaningful natural and social orders that facilitate, and here's the key phrases, greater spontaneity, security, and metaphysical comfort, resulting in a special, resilient, sustainable, and enduring form of happiness. So that's from the précis. So yeah, I think people who don't know that much about the oneness literature and about, Buddhism, Neo-Confucianism, and Taoism, they probably will have some sense of how, you could derive a sense of security from the experience of oneness and seeing yourself as part of a larger whole. I think anyone who's sort of worried about death has found, at least I can speak from some experience, found some comfort in recognizing that they are part of a much larger whole, which will outlive them, and that they've contributed to it in some lasting way. So I think they'll understand what you mean by security. as a resilient, sustainable, and enduring sort of happiness. But not everyone will understand what you mean by spontaneity and metaphysical comfort. So I hope it's not asking too much, but I was just wondering if you could explain a little bit how this big picture account of oneness fits in with spontaneity and metaphysical comfort.
Yeah. And again, this is something I've written on separately, spontaneity, and both of them actually. But on spontaneity, I mean, what Hobbes talks to about being spontaneous is any action done not out of fear.
Oh, I see.
If you go back and read Leviathan, he defines it that way. And Kant, of course, talks about spontaneity in terms of being von selbst, out of yourself, right? So they have views of spontaneity, but they're different, right? For Kant, it's you feel this sense of freedom, and it's a sense of dignity when you act in ways that you're not in any way constrained by nature. When you act on a maxim you rationally devise and stuff, you're not just following out. And that's why the good-hearted person doesn't get moral merit and all of that kind of stuff. And for Hobbes, society should be set up in a way that allows you to be as free from fear and act on your spontaneous desires. So first off, I would say, actually, Western philosophers use this concept a lot, but they have different conceptions of the general idea of spontaneity. And in East Asia, people have different conceptions. Taoists have a sense of spontaneity that they trust in nature so much that you're supposed to really tune down the social and cultural and let nature flow through you. The late Joel Kupperman once, at times they sound a little bit like beatniks, which dates Joel. That's but one thing that's important to realize is both beatniks and Taoists, when they say just let it all hang out, they don't really mean that. If you were a beatnik and you just let it all hang out, that would not be cool. To be cool means to, just like be detached a bit from more and not be invested in some of the social goals and stuff. That's more like the Taoists. So they're not like when they say follow nature or be spontaneous, they don't just mean do whatever. That would not be for them violating nature. Nor does following nature mean following your desires, because they think that our desires tend to go to excess. So they think you need to train yourself out of the socialized world, and then you're going to end up being more like what you might call cool. You're not going to be acting on every desire. I don't understand how anyone can think that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a commentary on my early life. So what are some other examples? But if we're going with the Taoist, there are things like the natural human tendency to play, which may be fundamental to our social discourse. It may be fundamental to communication. A lot of people have written on this, but surely play is something that's spontaneously part of human beings. Laugh with people, conversation is. So those parts are really kind of there, standing inclinations. If we lose touch with them by being like, I remember this, I gave this lecture on spontaneity. One of the students said, well, I can't just go back and play with my 3-year-old niece on the beach. And I go like, why not? Well, people won't take me seriously. And I go like, who cares about them? So there are certain human tendencies we should just give in to. Now, other forms of spontaneity are what I call cultivated, like the Confucians tend to be more, and are things like we learn to be how to interact with people. We learn, if you're a musician, you learn play your instrument. You take part in a legacy. Read Wynton Marsalis on the history of jazz. He's connected to all with Western music, And yet, in order to be spontaneous, to play in a jazz ensemble and stuff, you need to have cultivated that. And if you do that and you're playing in that ensemble, or you're singing in a choir, or you're just having a freewheeling conversation with people about philosophy, all of those things give you a sense of, I think we think they're superior to ways in which we have expressions like, God, the guy was so hard to talk to. It was like pulling teeth, Well, obviously then being able to spontaneously chat with someone is a good thing. Oh, you went out on a date with somebody. How was it? Oh my God. I couldn't be spontaneous. I couldn't be myself with him, So I think we value spontaneity. And again, the East Asian tradition, it's not just one sense. It's cultivated and uncultivated are general terms. But then I would say, and it also will alert us to things in our own tradition and in our own lives. Again, it's a kind of stalking horse to think about a phenomenon we value. I think that's a value that we underestimate. And metaphysical comfort is just being at home where we are. Freud very famously responded to a friend of his who talked about the oceanic feeling. He said, that naive desire to go back to the womb. It's a kind of regressing. And you kind of go like, well, yeah, it could be that. It could be that, just huddle up in the natal, in the position there and just withdraw from the world. Or it could just be feeling, I felt very, very profoundly metaphysical comfort when my daughter graduated from the master's program at Smith, and we had all the families together for a dinner. And I just felt like you had reached something in your life and are connected to this people, this institution and her life. And it just felt like, God, I felt so blessed. Now, you might just say, oh, what is that supposed to feel? I felt I was at home. I felt familiar here. Those of us who have lived in other cultures know what metaphysical discomfort feels like.
Yeah.
When you go somewhere and you say, whatever language, where's the bathroom? And they go like, huh?
Yeah, right.
And then when you can go home and be around the familiar. And then I'm also here, I don't mean to belabor it too much, I'm also deeply influenced by a guy I mentioned earlier, E.O. Wilson. Human beings just are more at home in certain environments than in others. Yeah. That's why you pay more for certain real estate than you do for others. But taking this further, I think it's a delusion to think that we're going to be comfortably living in space. I know Elon Musk wants everybody to go to Mars, but I notice he's not in the front of the line. Are you going to play with your kids on Mars? Go out and play. Oh, no. Say you could do interstellar travel and get to other Earth-like planets. First off, why do you think they're going to be uninhabited? Secondly, why do you think the flora and fauna are going to be things that are going to be good for us, or things we're going to feel not just a nightmare? I think people really underestimate how important being on the Earth and keeping it in something like its present state is for human flourishing. That's what I mean by metaphysical comfort. Now, of course, you can take that to another thing is like, well, I feel like I've realized as a Buddhist would that all things are empty and I'm now one with everything and I feel great compassion for all sentient beings. Or you could feel I'm doing my best to realize God's plan and, on this earth. Those are other sources of deep metaphysical comfort. But I'm saying you could feel versions of those without the robust metaphysics.
Yeah.
That's what I'm hinting at or gesturing toward.
So where it's more conducive to the experience of oneness to live among organisms that we've co-evolved with, because of course we can interact with them in this spontaneous way. We don't have to think about, how to respond to a snake or a flower or a cat or what have you.
And the reason we were generally spontaneously repelled by snakes, and so is every other animal that's close to us, like apes and monkeys, except for lemurs, because there are no venomous snakes in Madagascar. But the reason we respond that way is we're attuned to that. And the reason we like to look down over an open grassy area with water around it is because that's the ideal hunter-gatherer.
Yeah.
And living in concrete high-rise buildings is bad for you, psychically, spiritually, and every other way. So yeah, metaphysical comfort can get as metaphysical as you want, but what I'm talking about is a sense of being at home and finding your place in relation to other people, creatures, and things.
Great. I'm sorry to monopolize so much, Richard. I should let you ask some of your questions.
Actually, you touched on a number of questions I already had. I guess, the idea that virtues can be understood as traits that help us to move away from self-centeredness, that's really interesting. At one point, you do talk, PJ, about altruism and empathy and this possible objection that someone might raise toward your account of oneness. And you actually bring it up yourself, which is, of course, you just being a good... So the possible objection is something like, well, can you make sense of altruistic acts or self-sacrificial acts? And I've been interested in that topic for a long time because it's a common objection to also eudaimonism, which I'm very attracted to, because ultimately you're aiming to live the best life for yourself. So can you make sense of self-sacrifice and altruistic actions that more kind of modern moralists or maybe kind of Kantians would want to make space for. So I actually really enjoyed your discussion of that. And can you say a little bit more about that? And yeah, I think that might be helpful for the listeners. And I think that's really the only question I'm going to ask today.
That's a great question. It's really complicated and it's ongoing for me. So the word really comes out of a debate among psychologists, empirical psychologists. Batson, Cialdini have this ongoing debate saying, like, what is it to care for other things? Or how is it that we care for other things? And Batson says, well, it's part of this empathy altruism hypothesis, what's so called. That is, you empathize with other people in a roughly Humean, or, however you want to think about it, role-taking way, and you feel their pain as your pain. And when you do that, you'll be more likely to care about their concerns. When I was an undergraduate, if you had said that, people would have laughed at you. Oh, no, evolution tells us that we're all just self-maximizing, blah, blah, blah. But of course, that's not true. And we do have these other regarding concerns. I think that there's a lot of them. Mencius, in his famous baby in the well example, many people who read that say that's the first example of altruism or empathy, but it's really not, because the child is unaware that it's in danger, right? So you're not empathizing with the child. You just have a spontaneous concern for babies, and that's a good thing. Yeah. That's a thing we can understand from our evolutionary history, or however you want. So other regarding concern is, how do you explain it, is more complicated. Cialdini and these guys have the oneness view. They think that you care for things when you think of them as part of yourself, right? And so there's that debate. And so if you thought you could reduce everything to the empathy altruism hypothesis, there'd be an eliminativist kind of argument against oneness. I think that the argument is important and that they're both right to some extent, but that they're neither one of them, haven't kept up. So they may have reached a happy, harmonious compromise. But in my view, they're doing the thing that I try to avoid. I mean, not intentionally, but I just have been led to avoid is, I don't think there's a single theory that explains our concern for others, or other people, creatures, and things. And I think thinking that there is again, part of an inheritance of a certain way of thinking about ethics that I think is misguided. So empathy altruism definitely work. There are a number of people, Batson and others, who not only have empirical evidence and have very cleverly isolated that concern from kind of self-concern, or some people say when one baby cries and another one cries, hearing it, they're just annoyed at the crying. It's a aversive affective response, they call that. But they've been able to isolate. You could escape, but you don't, and you help. Right? And they've shown that you can teach altruism, you can cultivate altruism in young children by intervening and getting them to role play. And it really does have an effect. So, I mean, empathy and altruism works. There's a new book out called, I think it's called The War for Kindness or something like that, by a young psychologist at Stanford. I think his name is Zaki, Z-A-K-I, but I'm getting to the age where I might be off. If I am, please forgive me. I love this book because he thinks this is a big problem. How do we cultivate more empathy? And one of the most fascinating things he did, which I think is just really interesting for us all, is he's very interested in this research on gaming. Are there games that you can go in a virtual world and then come out and be more caring? Yes, there are. I mean, there's pretty solid data. I mean, evidence that if you do that, you come out. Now, how long that stays with you is an open question, and my guess is it would diminish. But all of these are fascinating contemporary questions, right? So why would you say, well, who needs oneness? Well, here's a couple of reasons. Empathy altruism hypothesis does not work very well when you're talking about other creatures, living things, and the rest of the world. I mean, those of us who live with, I know Justin and Melanie have two beautiful cats. Why do they care for those cats? Well, you might say, well, because I empathize with them. When we had our two cats, my wife would always say, of course, I understand what Simba and you do. Wait a minute, I have to see if she's... No, we can empathize with maybe reasonably discomfort and pain, but you don't know what it is to be a cat. You can imagine what it'd be like to have whiskers and a tail, be able to jump like that, but why do you really care for those? If you listen to people, my experiences, and the right way to think about it is because they're part of my life. When people say they're one of the family, people spend an amazing amount of resources, psychic treasure, time with these creatures because they love them. And why? Because they enhance, hopefully, each other's lives. But empathy that's not the right explanation there. I think the right explanation is oneness. They're part of you. Again, metaphysically, I don't mean they're like stuck onto you, but they're part of your life. Your life, when you lose such creatures, like when you lose other people you love, you feel like your arm was torn off, gut-wrenching, right? Then think about plants. I mean, my wife and I spend an inordinate amount of time taking care of the plants on our property. She comes in and gives a report about, the pine tree's doing better now. I've given it some. I don't think I'm sitting there thinking, oh, well, if I were a pine tree, I'd like more. I can understand what a fern needs or whatnot and be interested in it because it's part of my life. Or I want to preserve the rainforest because it's part of the planetary ecosystem. I don't have to empathize with it.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you identify with those, like the cats or even plants, because they're living organisms. They have life in them.
Sure.
And so there's this deep connection, and we're all obviously living organisms of a very different kind. But so then we kind of see that oneness connection with all those different living creatures, even if they're just grass or trees. By the way, I really love this idea because sometimes people think morality is all about kind of like doing things that sucks, and you got to give up everything and you got to grit your teeth and do the hard thing, It's set up sort of like, oh, that's the highest moral ideal, You do things that just kind of ruin you or something. Actually, this conception of morality does seem like it's part of your good. It seems to be inclined toward that direction. That's a more kind of eudaimonistic orientation, I would think.
Absolutely. No, I mean, of course, I know all your work. And when I read it, I said, this is, at least in my view, if not perfectly, awful doggone close to being compatible with surely the view that I'm arguing for. I would add that I've gone all the way Wang Yang Ming on this. And I do think we feel one with the things, even inanimate objects. We surely feel that way with artifacts. I had just left Korea many years ago when a fire broke out on Namdaemun, one of the great gates in Seoul. And people cried. People came out and bowed to the gate, and it was very moving. Now, I don't think they're confused.
Right.
I don't think they're going, oh, Namdaemun must be hurting.
Must be hurting.
Yeah, it must be hurting. They just saw a part of their culture. And now I, as a Westerner, I'm not Korean or anything, but I was hurt when I saw it. It broke my heart. So we can see that about that. Or when the Taliban destroyed those beautiful Buddhist statues, I was angry. Not very Buddhist feeling. I won't apologize for being from Jersey, but I just because gosh, who are you? I mean, that's a beautiful thing. So I feel that way about. I used to go to Yosemite Valley a lot, hike in the high country. I thought, God, what a beautiful place. We should all work to keep that. If somebody's destroyed El Capitan or something, I would just feel terrible. Frankly, I think this way about the planet now. I try to think this way about the planet. This is my home. So I want to keep it like I want to keep my house clean. I want to keep it functioning. So I think we can do that. And I'll even go one more just so in case people think I'm not crazy enough. Wang Yang Ming once said, and other Neo-Confucians said it, that they are the mind of heaven and earth, that they are the mind of the universe. And I used to think, here we go again with the kind of metaphysical stuff. That's really cool. On the other hand, we're maybe narcissistic or whatever, But when he said that, he meant that he's responsible for everything in the world. Not that he's the top dog and can do whatever he wants. He thought about it more in the way certain Christians think about being shepherds to God's creation. We're here to take care of what God gave. He didn't give it to us to burn up, but to respect and revere as his work. So thinking about Wang Yangming that way, I thought, in my view, we are the only creatures that have a moral or aesthetic feel. I live on a beautiful little lake, as Justin knows, and I go out and I feel blessed to be among these other animals that are flying and swimming, but I don't think any of them appreciate being there with me. I think they're just looking for something to eat. So this aesthetic and kind of, I would say, spiritual feeling, seeing a beautiful sunset. If there were no humans, despite the kind of Disney movies that show all the animals watching the sunset go down, we're the only ones that do. And we're the only ones that care when we do care about each other, but also about other creatures and things. So Wang Yangming's right, that at least on the planet, we are the heart mind of heaven and earth. We are the source and the grounds of moral feelings among the creatures. I'm not saying there's not a higher or deeper. And then I said, well, but that's true also of the solar system. Everybody gets excited, and I am too, that, they found ice that might have old bacteria in it, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's really cool. But nobody's sitting there going like, I wonder if they like the sunset. And no. Yeah. And then if you think about just our solar system, if you think about our galaxy, I think the people that are sure there's other intelligent life in the galaxy, I think that they're just living a dream, maybe, but there's no evidence for it. And there's been plenty of time to hear from at least a lot of these things. We would have get radio waves, or they would have gotten radio waves from us. So
I thought there are UFOs all the time like that. Or now, like,
well, there's a lot of talk about UFOs, but we haven't seen one. Right?
I haven't seen one. But
yeah, I haven't seen one yet. And I just think, in fact, we just read this guy who's an astrophysicist at MIT, who he said, the idea that you think that there's intelligent life out there is just an expression of some kind of hope. He said, yes, evolution is happening everywhere else, but look at us from maybe several billion years, 2.5, 3 billion years. We're the only fully self-conscious life that evolved on this planet, even though this massive amount of life. Why not? Maybe there's just vegetation or fungus or something in these other places. Surely, though, on the planet, in the solar system, and probably in the galaxy, if not the known universe, we may be the heart mind of heaven and earth. And I think that should humble us to say, wow, we ought to do a better job than we're doing.
Yeah. Tragically, I think our discussion has gone quite a while now. And I have to say, I feel like we've only just dipped our toes into the book. I mean, so what we've discussed here is really interesting. I think it's going to be hopefully suggestive enough to get people to read the book. But I just wanted to mention briefly, there's so much more about psychology, religious experience, even pragmatism and Freud, virtues, theories of the virtues and such. And I hope readers will check it out. So we're trying to establish a tradition of asking our interviewees 3 standard questions. So maybe I'll let Richard lead with the first of the 3. I'll take the second one.
All right. So to sort of wrap up this wonderful conversation that's been very rich and very stimulating. So what are you working on next? Do you have any big projects you'd like to mention?
Well, one of them Justin's a part of, and that is this 3-year research group on cosmopolitanism, sponsored by Georgetown Global Studies, which has been great, but it also has made me think that a lot more work needs to be done. I've tried to get more and more Western people that specialize on cosmopolitanism involved, because our project is to say, well, what kinds of conceptions of cosmopolitanism can we find outside the West, and specifically in East Asia? And I have to say, the response has not been overwhelming. I think people are very happy to go to live in familiar places and work with familiar problems. I hope that is changing. I think it is changing. I think I really do see a generational change. Younger philosophers, I mean, compared to when I was, like your age, Richard, I mean, people would just like, well, no, they didn't with me, because they always were worried a little bit, what was he going to do? But I mean, people are just, I think because it's more and more unavoidable, the plurality of values and ways of living that, at least in many ways, are appealing and in some ways preferable, to keep in this idea, committed to this approach that seems to think everybody's striving to become more like us, is harder to maintain, thank God. Yeah, so the cosmopolitanism thing is one thing. I've kind of been turning more recently, as you both know, I realized at one point that I have many interests and some abilities, but one of my interests and abilities is in translation. And so I have a deep love for the Korean people and its culture for personal reasons, and as well as I think I could give objective reasons. And one of the things I've bemoaned is that there's not enough really good, reliable translations of Korean philosophy. So I recently co-authored a book on these two amazing women from 18th century women, Confucian philosophers, Im Yunji-dang and Gang Jung-il-dang, and with Hua-Young Wang. Professor Wang and I are also working on a companion volume in the Hackett series, Korean Confucian philosophy. That will be out maybe in another year and a half or so. And finally, I'm working with Eric Hutton and Justin Series to do a complete translation of the Chung brothers, one of their main works. And after that, I'm just probably going to do a lot more fishing. Rest to you guys. So, the philosophical issue is cosmopolitanism, and I'm still interested in oneness and altruism and those kinds of things. Of course, my new work is really mostly translation.
Yeah. Very grateful that you've taken on these translation projects, PJ. And of course, a little bit of it is sort of admittedly selfish because I have this translation series that you're contributing to. But I also just think that basically to be a good translator of old historical texts in a dead language, literary Chinese, it's basically a lifelong endeavor to get to the point that you can do that sort of thing well, so you can convey not just the meaning, but also the sort of the spirit or the sense of the language to readers of another language. So anyway, it would be a shame if you didn't take advantage of this sort of really incredible body, a sort of foundation of resources and skills that you've built up over your lifetime. I feel like, as someone who sometimes does translation a lot less and a lot less capably than you, I feel like it's bottomless exercise learning to translate old texts well. I'm always discovering new stuff by joining different reading groups, what have you. So anyway, so our other standard question for our interviewees has to do with texts in the Chinese philosophical tradition. So we're just sort of curious to know if there's one text that you would recommend to someone who didn't know anything about Chinese philosophy, what would be the one that you would urge them to read?
I think that's a really tough one because it really depends on what their interests are and what their training is. There are texts that I love that I think would be really bad for the uninitiated to jump into. I think Neo-Confucianism has a higher entry cost.
Yes.
Or a text like the Analects is just, its value only comes after multiple readings and a lot of reflections.
Yeah.
Whereas something like the Xunzi, I think, is much more accessible, especially to people who are philosophers. If you're a philosopher and you don't think there's philosophy in East Asia, early China, for instance, read the Xunzi or the Mozi, and you just can't possibly hold that view anymore. Or read quite a few of the texts of later Confucianism in Korea, the so-called 4-7 debate. If you want to see people that want to do a lot of fine-grained analysis and interactive, I would hesitate to recommend anything. I would rather have people consult somebody that maybe they know or whose work they know and share their interests and then be guided that way. That's a much better approach.
All right. So the last question that we have for you, PJ, is what is one idea or insight from your study of Chinese philosophy that, if taken seriously, would help people lead better lives?
Well, of course, I'm tempted to say oneness.
Which is one idea, yes.
I guess two things I would say about it. One is really very generally, I think the idea of self-cultivation, it's a theme shared among almost all East Asian traditions. And it's something, of course, we have in the West, but is much more out of fashion. And I think that's incredibly unfortunate. I just give you one example. I'm unhappy with the way some people behave on occasion. But as I've gotten older and under the influence of my study of East Asia, I've come to believe that most people act badly because they're either ignorant or they were treated very badly or they've just failed to learn and work on themselves. And that's to their detriment and to the detriment of the people around them. I'm much less inclined, I could say much less inclined than I did when I was a youth, to judge and to respond to them in a negative way, and much more inclined to say, is there a way to try to get this person to sign up for a course of learning and working on themselves in the faith that they will lead better, more fulfilled, more satisfying lives? So that whole orientation, and it's something, I guess I kind of brought up this way to always, try to improve yourself. But I just think it's something that a lot more people, young people in East Asia, are brought up with. Now, it has negative forms as well, but the idea that through learning and through reflection and through practice, you can improve yourself and make contributions to the world, I just think that's right and it's important. But then my meta point would be, anybody who's looking for ideas in other cultures is already doing something I think terribly important, which is to break out of the provincialism that I think it's just a natural human inclination, but maybe even excessively strong in our culture. Look out there and sincerely, critically, don't just go like, oh, I want to be whatever, critically, but with an open mind. And I know you're going to find a lot of things that will change you for the better.
Great.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
Yeah, great concluding thoughts. Nicely caps off a wonderful discussion with PJ. We want to thank you again for joining us, PJ. It was really wonderful to talk about your work.
Well, thank you so much. It was a great honor, and talking with you guys is always fun.
Great.
Thank you so much, PJ.
So that was The Way for today, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Wait for today. Okay, I like that.
Yeah.